what makes up a functional mobility exercise? That's what we're going to be talking about in this tutorial. In part one, we're going to talk about how we define what a functional exercise is, and then we'll start talking about exercises that are mobility exercises, but they are functional. If you do want some help with your mobility, be it the hips, the ankles, the spine, or the shoulders, then please do hit the link below, go through to my How to Improve Mobility page, and then we'll get you in for a 2-hour consultation, assessment, and workshop where we'll take you through everything that you need to improve the mobility at the joint that you want. Part one, we've got to understand what functional exercise is, and then we can add the mobility part into it. Now, most people understand functional exercise to be an exercise that replicates everyday movement. So, like a squat or a deadlift when it's lifting. So those would be described as functional exercises. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of redefine it, or just put my definition into it. And I'm going to say that function or functional exercise isn't necessarily or isn't only those exercises that replicate everyday movement. They are exercises that enhance our everyday movement. So what that does, that opens up to a different or more exercises that can become functional. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at the deadlift. So that's basically bending forward and lifting something up. So we're going to look at some exercises that can enhance that movement and make it better. We're not just looking at that one exercise. So what then happens is these other exercises become functional because they are enhancing our function, if that makes sense. So that's how I'm going to be talking about functional exercise throughout this tutorial. Part two, we're looking at the functional exercise. So as I've mentioned, we're going to be talking about the deadlift. So that is where we come into this position, we hinge over, and we lift. So that is going to help us lift the shopping bags, lift a box off the floor, many different things, but anything that involves bending and lifting, like I did, sort of bending forward, moving the kettlebell into place. So the deadlift is going to help us with that everyday movement, but it's also going to help us gain strength, gain mobility, so on and so forth, if we're doing it properly. And that sort of brings me to part one, is that doing the deadlift is going to be helpful for the deadlift because there's a lot of technique that comes with it. We've got to be able to hinge forward from the hip, not bend the knee so much so the shin stays more vertical. The body's got to come over, but when the body comes over, the chest has got to stay up as it comes over. We've got to keep the head in line. We've got to keep the hands close to the body. So we've got all those technique points that need to be understood first. And then we come into the position and then we lift. But what we've also got to understand is what are the exercises that are going to help us do that movement better. So if we haven't got the range of movement, so if I can't get all the way down here like that, and I need to round my back, what is it that I need to be able to get down that far? Because those exercises are going to enhance my function and therefore they become functional exercises. So what we're going to do in the sort of the second part of part two is we're going to look at 3 exercises. There are more, but obviously we don't need this tutorial to be 1 hour, 2 hours long. We just need to keep it short, we need to keep it sharp, and we're going to look at 3 exercises that can enhance and improve the deadlift. The first exercise is hip internal and external rotation. Believe it or not, your hips need good internal and external rotation to be able to do the deadlift. So when we come into this position, all everyone knows is hip flexion. So coming down into this position is hip flexion. So everyone knows that we need hip flexion to get down into the deadlift, but what they don't always understand is the hip internal and external rotation. And what that basically means is this position, and it's that's external rotation, and that's internal rotation, because the knee's going inwards, the knee's going outwards. So those are the 2 rotations. So a very simple exercise for this one is just to come down onto the floor. So this would be the first functional mobility exercise, would be coming into this position and dropping down. So on this leg, I'm getting the external rotation, and on this leg, I'm getting the internal rotation. Now, the key to this one is keeping the hips in as sort of a set a position as possible. So we drop forward, and you'll feel when the tightness comes in, and then you come over and then reset to the other side. And again, what is probably best to do, spend a little bit of time in each side, and then what that will do, that will allow you to gain a little bit of extra range of movement each time you do it. So you would say we do, say 8 reps, so 4 each side. So that would be 1, and we would get down this far. Then we would come over, and we get down a little bit further, we get down a little bit further, and then each time we're just going down further and further, but holding 5 seconds at a time, just down in the position, just trying to open out the hips. The other key thing for it is don't take the body with you as well. So we're not doing that because we're not really getting a great deal from the hip. So we need to keep the sort of the hips and the shoulders, the head and the shoulders and the hips facing forwards. So we're then getting what we want from the hips when we do the internal and external rotation. Because when we go down into the deadlift and a squat as well, is we need the ability to externally rotate to get down into that position. That's going to allow us to get down a little bit further. Also, the muscles will function better if we've got good hip internal and external rotation. The second exercise is a kneeling hip hinge. Because what we're, again, as we're trying to get good hip flexion. Now, we've talked about hip internal and external rotation. So what I'm basically doing with these first 2 exercises is splitting the internal and external rotation and the hip flexion into their component parts and then bring them all back together in the deadlift. So we would come down onto our knees. So we're, in some respects, we're sort of taking the internal and external rotation out of it, but we're coming down on the knees. And now what we're trying to do is get down into this position. But what we're trying to do here is maintain this position. Because what people do, if they've got limited hip flexion, is they will round at the lower back. So they'll start to sort of round into this position, which is basically saying they can't flex at their hip, so their spine has to do it. So what we have to do is in this kneeling position, because it cuts out the knee and downwards, down to the feet. So what we're doing is we're getting down into this position and really forcing the pelvis back and to maintain what would be the neutral position of the pelvis. A lot of people, when they get down to this position, think it's anterior rotating, but because the body's come over as well, the pelvis should stay completely neutral. And then all it means is the hamstrings need more length, the psoas needs more length, the iliacus needs more length, because when they don't have length, that's when it starts to get pulled around. So exercise number 2 is a kneeling hip hinge to allow greater hip flexion. Exercise number 3 is a full squat, so the ability to squat down fully. Now, this is going to be different for different people because there are range of movement at many different joints. But what we're going to try and do is explain why a full squat is useful for a deadlift. And the main reason is to do with the core stability. And what that means is the muscles turning themselves on at the right time. If you've got an unstable core, you will find it hard to get down into the position because certain muscles have to turn on at certain times as you go down and as you come back up. So it's very useful for any sort of hip flexion to be able to get down into these types of positions. Whether the back rounds or not, it just shows that there is a degree of core stability, a degree of multi-joint flexibility to be able to get down into this type of position. Now, for someone that can't do that in and of their own self and just go straight down into it, a very simple remedy is to use something and just walk down a bar like this. Because what will start to happen is the muscles will start to coordinate and realise that they can get down that bit further. You may not get all the way down, but they can certainly help you get down. Because all it's offering is it's taking out gravity from the equation, or your centre of gravity, I should say, from the equation. Because you won't feel like you want to fall forwards or fall backwards, because that's managed by how much you're leaning onto the cable. The other way is to use a kettlebell like this, and then this again is keeping the centre of gravity forward, and then you're just dropping down in, It's nice and smooth. Again, you can push the knees out for the external rotation, keep the feet relatively forward, and then you'll just hold in this position. And again, it's just training the muscles to be able to get down into the position so they time properly, so that when we come into this hip hinge, we know we've got the right muscles turning on at the right time, or enhancing their use at the right time. If you like this tutorial, hit the like button below. If you enjoyed the tutorial and you want to hear more, hit the subscribe button. And if you have a comment or a question, leave it down below and I'll do my best to get it answered.